All right. Before we get into these bitter winter articles, first wanted to discuss, what Christian and Catholic values are, like the fundamental values that most people probably take for granted or don't realize that they're there because it's a norm.
Yeah.
Anyway, I want to talk about these values or I want you to talk about these values and if they're compatible with a country like China, more predominantly their political arm, the CCP.
Yeah. Probably the first one that comes to mind is the idea of, it's a Latin phrase called the Imago Dei, which just means the image of God, which is central to Christian and coincidentally Catholic theology. So it's the idea that every person is created in the image of God and they have intrinsic value.
Okay.
When you read the Constitution, you read the phrase, every man has inalienable rights granted to them by God, meaning that every human being has certain rights, certain worth that they are born and created with, and they can't be violated. So anybody that violates those is engaging in an evil act. So central to the idea of Christianity and Catholicism would be the idea of an objective worth and thus an objective right to live a certain way that everybody has. And so we see that in Western civilization, specifically in America, because the Constitution was based on, or at least grounded in Christian principles, maybe not specifically in everything it says, but in principle. So when we look at something like China and communism, Marxism, socialism, or any collectivist group, those ideas are pretty much impossible to reconcile, because within communism it'd be more of like an anthill ideology, right? Like the whole is more important than the individual. So the sum total is important. So in China, the system, communism, the state control is more important than the rights and the freedoms of the individual because they're working more towards the whole.
So Christianity is more focused on individualism, whereas the CCP and a lot of communist societies are more focused on collectivism.
Yeah, collectivism.
Collective thought,
And whoever is in power is the one who controls the narrative.
As a brief tangent, was this a novel idea? Historically, was this a novel idea that there's like a spark of divinity within each person?
I guess, yeah, very generally speaking. Maybe not a spark. In the Christian, we wouldn't say a spark. Maybe in a lot of religions, yeah. Like Hindu, Eastern religions, Gnosticism, they would say there's a spark of divinity, which would mean that there's a piece of the divine in you, or you are a part of the divine. Kind of getting into, I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but yeah, the idea that there's multiple gods and you're part of the universe. For Buddhism or Hinduism, for instance, you're trying to reach nirvana, which is the idea that you are trying to work your way through good works and good thoughts and good living in order to reconnect with the universe. And so you are a part of the universe is a part of you, so you're all connected. So the universe and yourself are all part of this divine something. So in that idea, you would have a spark of the divine, which would in essence be the universe. So you're trying to reconnect with it. So then it would vary obviously, but generally there's the idea of some kind of divinity.
How does it benefit? Another digression before we get into our main topic. How does it benefit an atheist to live in a society that has, I suppose they would argue, the supernatural belief that they have a spark of divinity within them? How would it benefit an atheist to live in a society like that?
Well, just generally, you freedom, you get self-worth. So even if you don't hold to the idea of divinity or Imago Dei or things like Christians do, then you just by proxy experience those freedoms. You experience that respect from your fellow man.
Innocent until proven guilty.
Yeah, innocent until proven guilty. And the idea of justice as a whole, because the idea of morality, objective morality is something that comes from Christianity or religion in general. So even if you don't believe in those things, you still experience the fruits of that. Even in a political view, we're going to talk about China, but we were watching a YouTuber who calls himself a communist, anti-fascist, all these ideas. So even in America, you can be a card-carrying member of the Communist Party and still experience all the freedoms, the court systems, the justice that America provides. So even if you don't hold to that ideology, you still benefit from it.
Do you think that this value promotes diversity of ideologies, diversity of ideas?
Yeah, I would say so. Because just obviously, as a Christian, you would hold to a certain belief or a certain truth system, but you don't believe because you hold to a moral standard that it's wrong to enforce those ideas on others. So, like forcible conversion, we'll just use Christianity as an example. In Catholicism, during the Inquisition, the idea that you can forcibly convert somebody into believing something would be something wrong, because you can't really force anybody to believe something. You can force them to claim they believe it, but they won't actually believe it. So, yeah, the idea of freedom of thought, freedom of individuality, things like that, yeah, it'd be very beneficial.
All right, well then, let's get into a series of articles from Bitter Winter. And how about just talk about Bitter Winter briefly?
Yeah, Bitter Winter is a new site. They have several sources that they have in China. Obviously, they would leave unnamed for obvious reasons of persecution and arrest. But they have done a pretty good job of bringing to light persecution of the Christian, or the Christian church. I'll use that broadly, Catholic, any denomination or version of Christianity. So they would edit that out. Yeah, so they provide actual, because the news networks or the news sites in China are obviously not going to talk about this. It's all hidden. It's all squashed. It's all, the persecution is never reported on in mass. So Bitter Winter does a good job of giving a certain instances or multiple instances of the CCP trying to shut down religion, free speech in any way, shape, or form.
First article we're going to talk about from Bitter Winter is Tension Escalates in the Diocese of Mindong, June 10th, 2019.
So that article is talking about China's attempt to create a state-run arm of Catholicism, as they do with everything. In communism, specifically in China, nothing is outside of the rule and the discretion of the government. So they created the Chinese Patriotic Catholic Association, the CPCA, which is their way of controlling religion in any way, shape, or form. That's specifically Catholicism here. So what they've done is they've tried to come to an agreement with Rome, with the Vatican. Obviously, when they say come to an agreement, they mean China said this is what we're going to do, and they're trying to create a state-run communist version of Catholicism. Obviously, so Catholicism isn't allowed to teach that China's government, their constitution, anything that they're doing is wrong, illegal, or immoral. So what they did is they took an excommunicated priest that the Vatican excommunicated for reasons that the article doesn't mention. But for some reason, he violated his vows as a Catholic, as a priest, and was excommunicated, thrown out of the church, which in theology or in Catholic doctrine meant that he was headed to hell, separated. So China says, okay, this is our agreement. We're coming to you. This is what you're going to have to sign in order to be legally guarded, in order to teach and preach here. Oh, and by the way, we're going to provide our own priest to be in charge of this, to make sure that it runs the way we want it to be run. So China puts forth this priest and says, okay, this is the guy. This is the one that I have to have in charge. If you want to take it or leave it. And so the Vatican reinstitutes this priest, perhaps even begrudgingly, just in order to allow some form of legal protection for Catholicism, even at a nominal level.
What was the purpose of the CCP creating a state-run Catholic Church?
It's just more control. They want to be in control of everything, and they know. There's always going to be an underground church, but it's harder to track that. So if you're a member of the surface level or the state church, they know who you are. You're a member of it. They have your name. They can find out who you are. They can also.
So you have to register.
Yes, you would have to register. They would know who you're from. I'm sure fingerprints, maybe even facial scans, and they would also control what gets taught. So they can know, okay, well, yeah, it's a Catholic church, quote unquote Catholic church in teaching, but we control what is being disseminated through those churches. So they don't have to worry about anything being taught that goes against communism in general.
So at the time of this article, what was happening to any Catholics who were not submitting to the state-run church?
It's pretty much the same for all Christians across the country. There'd be It would depend on where you live. There's going to be various levels of persecution. Probably smaller towns, would receive maybe less persecution than if you were in a city because of the amount of police and the control. But in the article, we see that there's a gentleman who was an 80-year-old retired priest. He'd been done for preaching for probably over a decade. He's in a retirement home, and it so happens the retirement home is supported by Catholic charity. So it's a Catholic-run retirement home in China. Well, the officials in China come to him and say, okay, this is an agreement. They call it an application, but it's kind of like a non-disclosure, just an agreement where you say, okay, I won't preach or teach anything that goes against what is officially being prescribed by China. They go to him in the nursing home, try to force him to sign it. He says no because it goes against his Catholic morals and his Catholic convictions. They take him out of the nursing home, threaten to tear down the nursing home, and also to tear down his church and the altar where he previously had preached but is now retired, unless he signed it, and he refused. So that's fairly common. A lot of times in smaller churches, people will just get abducted by the police in the middle of the night, 2, 3 in the morning. They come in your house, take you to prison. They can transfer you to any prison they want. So sometimes it can last days, sometimes it lasts weeks, sometimes people go to prison for years. But it's hard to track because China doesn't have a court system like we do, where you can where prison are they, or where are they going, how long. Their justice system is fairly irrelevant in terms of individual rights like that. So it's hard to track.
Interesting. All right. So turns out that things did escalate.
Mm-hmm.
So that article is June of 2019, and the next article of interest was late 2020, actually, only a matter of months ago.
Yeah.
And this was titled, "One More Priest Tortured to Force Him into Official Church."
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so he's a 46-year-old priest who is visiting, I'm assuming, members of his church in a hospital. So he's probably giving them, last rites if they're dying. They would give, the Roman Catholic Church calls it last rites, where they go and you confess your sins to a priest. It's kind of like your final farewell. You kind of, you can confess your sins and kind of prepare to die. And they would, argue go to purgatory. So he's probably there doing that, probably, preaching or teaching, maybe even sharing the gospel. And he was saying and doing things, or his church was preaching and teaching something that wasn't aligned with what China wanted him to do. So they go and they abduct him. He's tortured. They don't call it torture. They would call it maybe coercion, sleep deprivation. It's a comic tactic. What was the exact way they called it in the article?
Exhausting an eagle.
Yes. So they called it exhausting an eagle, which is a tactic that the FBI and the CIA have used on Middle Eastern terrorists, actually. Not the gong, but the sleep deprivation in particular.
Is that a slight on American way of life, or our sort of referring to it specifically as an eagle?
Could be, yeah. Yeah, but I mean, the eagle is our national bird. It's on our money. It's everywhere. The eagle kind of represents America. So that might have been a way, kind of a slam against Western ideology.
Kind of strange to title your torture method, like exhausting an eagle,
Yeah.
a majestic creature.
Yes, it is weird. I wonder if that's just like a direct translation. Maybe it's like a saying in Chinese. So when we translate it in English, it sounds weird, but it's really like,
right.
The early bird gets the worm. If you weren't in America, you'd be like, oh, freaking gross, dude. But it's, it's kind of so we understand what that means. So it could be a weird saying, something like that.
So what came of the Father Mao Shun?
He was tortured, and I believe he was released. But, I mean, he'll be arrested again. If it seems like he was tortured, he refused to change his stance, change his preaching. So he'll experience that again. He'll keep going through that because China never relents, and they have no reason to, because there's no punishment for China or the police, or, obviously we talk about the deep state in America, but they're kind of like the whole government's a deep state over there. So there's no penalty for them.
Lastly, is this simply a problem that if I were watching this video and I was not Catholic, much less a Catholic priest, would I be concerned at all? Should just any Westerner be concerned about traveling to China, or is this something that you don't have to worry about if you're a Catholic priest?
Yeah, I would say any Westerner should worry about this, because China is obviously, China, North Korea, Russia would be the extreme end, like the end goal of socialism, communism, Marxism. So they're the extreme, like the far left. So obviously, just traveling there, you can get arrested, you can experience that. You're not allowed to engage in free speech, but also is kind of a warning, because when Christianity is usually the first group when Marxism, socialism, any kind of collectivist group arrives in a country, the ideology spreads. Christianity is usually the first group to experience persecution. And the problem is that people look at that, they go, well, I'm not part of that group, that doesn't matter. But the issue is that it never ends there. They're never like, all right, we'll get all the Christians out, now everybody's free. No, it starts there and then it escalates. They go, oh, okay, because instead of being a battle between two religious ideologies, it's a battle between a religious ideology and statism. Like the state is total control.
Individualism versus collectivism.
Yes. So Christianity gets attacked first because it usually pushes back first, just because of its ideological underpinnings, but eventually it does affect everybody. So if you're, Richard Dawkins, and you're, a strict naturalistic materialist who hates Christianity, and you think, oh, it's cool, I'm not religious in any way, shape, or form, I'm safe, but then all of a sudden Britain starts doing something you don't like and you voice your opinion, well, now you're at odds with the state. And since the state is a collectivist, you're an individual, you're in the way of the collectivist narrative. So even if you're an atheist, you're not a Christian, if you're an agnostic, a Buddhist, a Hindu, it doesn't really matter. If you're at odds with the state in any way, shape, or form, and you live in a communist or Marxist society, you are going to eventually experience persecution of some form. So I think places like China, North Korea are a good warning for everybody to look forward and be like, okay, that's what it could eventually end up as. And if we don't want it to be there, eventually you have to find a spot somewhere before it progresses that far to stand up against.